I'm Savannah Sterling, 36, driving my vintage convertible across the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway through a wall of rain. Tonight was supposed to be simple: arrive at the estate, hear the will, and leave. Suit pressed, nerves steadied. But when my foot hit the brake, it found nothing but empty air. No resistance, just the snap of a cut line. At 60 miles an hour, I realized my family didn't just want me disinherited, they wanted me erased. So I made a choice. I wasn't going to the hospital. I was going to the funeral. Before I tell you what my mother's face looked like when the dead daughter walked into the parlor, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to see how far this story travels, to understand why my mother tried to kill me. You have to understand the architecture of the Sterling family. We lived in the Garden District of New Orleans, in a mansion that smelled of jasmine and old money. But the foundation was rotten long before I was born. My mother, Catherine, didn't raise children. She curated assets. My sister, Courtney, was the golden child. The show pony groomed for beauty pageants and society balls. She was perfect, pliable, and completely hollow. I was the spare, the black sheep, the one who asked too many questions and refused to smile on command. While Courtney was learning how to wave from a parade float, I was learning how to pour concrete and negotiate zoning permits. I left that house at 18 with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning need to prove them wrong. Over the next 15 years, I built a $30 million boutique hotel empire from the mud up. I did it without a single dime of Sterling money. But every time I closed a deal or opened a new location, my mother wouldn't offer congratulations. She would just ask why I couldn't be more like Courtney, who had never worked a day in her life. People always ask why I stayed in contact, why I let them treat me like an interloper in my own bloodline. The answer isn't simple. It is the trap of normalized cruelty. When you grow up in a household where affection is rationed like water in a drought, you do not realize you are dying of thirst. You think that is just how the world works. It is the boiling frog effect. They didn't start by cutting my brake lines. They started by forgetting my birthday, then dismissing my grades, then erasing my achievements. You learn to accept the unacceptable in microdoses until the toxicity feels like home. I thought if I just became successful enough, rich enough, or useful enough, they would finally see me. I was wrong. Usefulness was my death sentence. The catalyst was grandfather Arthur. He was the patriarch, the only person in the family who cared about the business rather than the image. When he died last week, the shield protecting my mother shattered. Arthur was the only one who checked the ledgers. His death meant the estate would be audited, and the will would be read. My mother knew what that audit would find. She knew about the $45 million missing from the charitable trusts. She knew that, as a successful businesswoman, I would be the one to spot the discrepancies immediately. She didn't hate me because I was a failure. She hated me because I was the only one competent enough to expose her. Elimination wasn't personal. It was a necessary business transaction to keep her secret buried. That is why I was on the bridge that night. And that is why, as I stood on the side of the road with rain mixing with the blood on my face, I realized the time for seeking approval was over. I wasn't going to the reading to inherit. I was going to burn their house down. I parked my rental car at the edge of the crushed shell driveway, leaving the wreckage of my convertible for the police to find on the bridge. The walk to the front door of the Sterling estate felt like moving through molasses. The New Orleans humidity clung to my skin, mixing with the sweat and the dried blood on my cheek. I hadn't changed my clothes. My white blouse was stained a rusty brown. and my left arm was wrapped in a crude bandage I had fashioned from a silk scarf. I looked like a walking crime scene, which was exactly the point. The library doors were closed. Inside, the air conditioning would be humming, keeping the antique books and my mother's composure perfectly preserved. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with my good arm and stepped into the cool, scented silence. The scene before me was a tableau of unearned grief. My mother, Catherine, sat in a high-backed velvet chair, dressed in impeccable black silk, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Courtney was beside her, looking fragile and lovely in a morning dress that probably cost more than my first car. Mr. Boudin, the family attorney, sat behind Grandfather Arthur's massive mahogany desk, reading from a thick document. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of a heart stopping. Catherine dropped her handkerchief. Her face went from performance grief to sheer, unadulterated horror. The color drained from her skin so fast I thought she might faint. Courtney made a small, strangled sound and gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles turning white. They were staring at a ghost. They had expected a phone call from the highway patrol, a solemn notification of a tragic accident on the bridge. They had not expected the victim to walk into the parlor. Savannah, Mr. Boudin said, his voice cracking. He stood up, his eyes widening as they took in the blood on my shirt and the raw scrape along my jawline. My God, what happened? I had some car trouble. Mr. Boudin, I said, my voice raspy but steady. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes locked on my mother. Someone cut the brake lines on the convertible, but I survived. Catherine didn't speak. She couldn't. She just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. I walked to the empty chair opposite them and sat down. The contrast was violent, their pristine, manicured elegance against my battered, bloody reality. Please, I said, gesturing to the papers in Boudin's hands. Continue. I believe you were discussing the future of the estate. Mr. Boudin looked from me to my mother, and then back to the document. He was a smart man. He had served Grandfather Arthur for 40 years. He saw the blood. He saw the terror in Catherine's eyes. And he remembered the instructions Arthur had given him in strict confidence just 2 weeks ago. He slowly set down the standard will he had been reading, the one that left the entire estate, the mansion, and the controlling shares of Sterling Hospitality to Courtney. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a different envelope. It was sealed with red wax. There is a secondary protocol, Mr. Boudin said, his voice dropping an octave. Arthur was very specific. He drafted a codicil, a conditional amendment. What are you doing? Catherine snapped, her voice shrill. Finally finding her tongue. Read the will. Boudin, the one Arthur signed in 2018. I cannot, Boudin replied, his hands shaking slightly as he broke the wax seal. The condition for this amendment was simple. It activates immediately if Savannah Sterling is harmed or prevented from attending this meeting by unnatural means. He looked at my bloody shirt. I believe the condition has been met. Catherine lunged forward, but it was too late. The seal was broken. The poison pill had been swallowed. Mr. Boudin adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling just enough to rustle the heavy parchment. He didn't look at my mother. He couldn't. He looked straight at me as he read the words that would dismantle the Sterling dynasty. I, Arthur Sterling, being of sound mind and suspecting foul play within my own house. Hereby decree the following. In the event that my granddaughter, Savannah Sterling, is injured, threatened, or impeded from attending this reading, the previous last will and testament is immediately null and void. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating, like the pressure drop before a hurricane, effective immediately. Boudin continued, his voice gaining strength. The entirety of the Sterling estate, including the Garden District Manor, the investment portfolios, valued at $100 million, and the 51% controlling interest in Sterling Hospitality, shall bypass the natural line of succession. All assets remain the sole property of Savannah Sterling. $100 million. The number hung in the humid air between us. For a heartbeat. Nobody moved. Then, Catherine shattered. It wasn't a scream. It was a guttural, animalistic sound of pure rage. She didn't look at the lawyer. She lunged across the gap between our chairs, her manicured claws reaching for my face. "You did this!" she shrieked, her mask of high society elegance disintegrating into something feral. "You ungrateful, manipulative little wretch. You hurt yourself just to steal what belongs to Courtney." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I sat there, smelling the copper scent of my own drying blood, and watched her unravel. This was the woman who had demanded perfection from me for 36 years, now reducing herself to a tantrum in front of the family attorney. "Sit down." "Mother," I said, my voice cold and flat, "or I will have security remove you from my house." My house. The words hit her like a physical blow. She froze, her chest heaving, realizing the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted. She was no longer the queen of the Garden District. She was a trespasser. Courtney was sobbing now. A soft, pathetic sound. "Mom. Please," she whimpered. "Please stop." "Don't you speak to me," Catherine whipped around, turning her venom on her favorite child. "You let this happen. You were supposed to be the future." But the escalation wasn't finished. The heavy oak doors of the library swung open again. But this time, it wasn't a servant with tea. It was 2 uniformed officers from the New Orleans Police Department, their rain slickers dripping onto the antique Persian rug. Behind them stood a detective I recognized from the news. Detective Landry. "Excuse the intrusion," Landry said, his eyes scanning the room before landing on the bloody bandage on my arm. "We received a call from the mechanic towing a vehicle off the causeway. He found something interesting. The hydraulic lines weren't frayed. They were cut. Clean. With wire cutters." Catherine stiffened, her back straightening into a rigid line of defiance. She thought she was untouchable here, protected by the walls of her mansion and the weight of her name. "This is a private family matter," Catherine hissed. "Get out." "Attempted murder isn't a family matter, Mrs. Sterling," Landry replied, stepping further into the room. He didn't walk toward Catherine. He walked toward the weeping woman in the mourning dress. "Courtney Sterling," the detective said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "We found a receipt for industrial wire cutters in your vehicle's glove box during the tow. We need you to come with us." The silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. Courtney looked up, her eyes wide and vacant, like a doll whose string had been pulled too tight. She didn't look at the police. She looked at our mother, begging for permission to speak, begging for a way out. But Catherine didn't look back. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask of stone, already calculating, already cutting her losses. And in that moment, I realized the horror hadn't ended on the bridge. It was just beginning. The click of the handcuffs was small, metallic, and final. Courtney didn't fight. She just slumped, her spine giving way under a weight I hadn't seen until that moment. The officers were reciting her rights, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes found mine, and for the first time in 33 years, the mask of the perfect debutante was gone. There was nothing behind it but terror. I had to, she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass. He has Madison? I froze. Madison, my 7-year-old niece. The family narrative was that she was at an equestrian camp in the hill country. Who has her? I demanded, stepping closer despite the officer's hand raised to stop me. Curtis. She choked out. Uncle Curtis. She isn't at camp. She is at Serenity Hills. Serenity Hills. The name made my blood run cold. It wasn't a camp. It was a high-end juvenile psychiatric facility on the North Shore. A place where wealthy families stashed inconvenient children to avoid scandals. And it was owned by a private equity firm, controlled by our Uncle Curtis, the man who had always been the family's shadow. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sabotage wasn't just about greed. It was coercion. My mother and uncle hadn't just corrupted Courtney. They had weaponized her motherhood. They had taken her child hostage to force her to kill her sister. I looked at Courtney. Really looked at her. And the anger that had been fueling me since the bridge began to curdle into something colder and more tragic. I had always envied her. I had hated her for being the chosen one. The golden child who got the praise. The dresses. The love. But standing there, watching her weep for a daughter she couldn't protect, I saw the truth. Being the golden child was never a blessing for Courtney. It was a slow destruction. I grew up the black sheep. Neglected but free enough to build a spine. Courtney never got that chance. Our mother hollowed her out and filled her with obedience until she wasn't a person anymore. Just Catherine's extension. She wasn't the villain. She was the first victim. I didn't want you to die. Courtney sobbed as officers led her away. They said if I didn't stop you, Madison would never come home. Where is she? I demanded. Ward 4. Restricted access. As the squad car lights faded into the rain, I knew my mother was already calculating her next move. She didn't care that Courtney was in handcuffs, only that her plan had failed. My niece is being held in a medical black site. I told Detective Landry, "We're not done. We need proof," he said. "Serenity Hills is a fortress. I'll get it." To do that, I had to stop being prey. I had to hunt. That's why, hours later, a wire was taped beneath my blouse as I walked back into the Sterling estate for dinner. Agent Miller's instruction echoed in my ear. She must admit to the 45 million and the kidnapping. Catherine greeted me at a table set for 2. Composed as ever. "I want to talk business," I said. "Courtney's arrest puts Sterling Hospitality at risk. I need to know the exposure." The bait worked. She leaned in. 45 million wasn't stolen, it was reallocated, she said smoothly. "Your grandfather never understood what it costs to maintain our name. And the brake lines. It was a calculation," she said flatly. "You would have exposed everything. I protected the family." That was the confession. The doors burst open. Federal agents. "Don't move." Catherine's mask shattered as the cuffs closed around her wrists. She glared at me with pure hatred. "You wire-wearing little traitor. You think this makes you powerful. I am the head of this family," I said. She tried one last weapon, telling me I was weak, just like my father. But she didn't know what I knew. Grandfather told me about the affair. I said. About Uncle Curtis. Courtney isn't Edward's daughter. I am the only legitimate Sterling heir. Catherine collapsed, finally defeated. As they dragged her into the rain, I looked at the empty chair she ruled from for decades. The reign was over, and I was the only Sterling left at the table.